Okay. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this webinar, If Not You, Then Who? Empowering parents of young children with disabilities to understand, identify, and set boundaries and around personal safety and community engagement. Dr. Olivia Caldeira will be our presenter tonight. Next slide. Next slide. So tonight, the Center for Disability Empowerment is hosting this time with a grant from the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities and the grant that they are holding the Ohio Family Network, Connecting Communities. Tonight, we are going to be talking with Olivia Caldeira, who is with Impact Safety, and we'll take it from there. Leave that slide there for a minute. The Center for Disability Empowerment is a 501c3 agency, and we are a nonprofit. We're a community-based, non-residential center for independent living that is driven by the choice and direction of people with disabilities. Our mission at CDE is to provide supports and resources for people with disabilities in order for them to be participants and contributors in their own communities as they live, learn, worship, work, and play alongside people who do not have disabilities. We know that in this webinar, we will be addressing some very sensitive and hard truths. We understand that talking about our bodies, sexuality, and scary things can be really uncomfortable for parents. Our goal is not to impose our values to you on how to raise your child. Rather, our goal is to introduce you to topics and points to consider when thinking about your child's development. We hope to provide a space to begin having open and honest discussion to help parents become more comfortable with sexuality education. When parents are more comfortable with these topics, it makes it easier for our young children to ask questions and have accurate information. Starting this early with young children builds trust and openness now and for more significant conversations in the future. If your child doesn't get the information from you, then it's possible they'll learn incorrect and harmful information from people who do not have their best interest in mind. To Dr. Caldeira, go ahead and move it to the next slide, Olivia. Right, Olivia and I have worked with each other for a couple of years, and as you see her picture there, beautiful blonde. Anyway, Dr. Olivia Caldeira, pronounced Caldeira, PhD, she, her, is an impactability instructor and sexuality and healthy relationship educator for people with developmental disabilities. As an advocate, author, and survivor, and ally, Dr. Caldeira has over 30 years of disability-related experience. Her goal is to provide education and empowerment tools to people with disabilities to promote healthy relationships and reduce the risk of abuse and interpersonal violence. She's also the developer and instructor for the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities grant, Speak Up, Stay Safe. So Olivia and I worked on this, the grant Speak Up, Stay Safe, which was geared for adults with IDD in the state of Ohio. We offered a community safety training, a day-long event in a variety of Ohio counties. But the one thing Olivia and I both felt with our take home was we need to be addressing this with parents with young children because we found that people did not attend because their guardian did not want them to be present, or perhaps a county, the SSA was nervous about talking about this type of stuff. So we know that people are not talking it to the adults that we've met. Not all of them, but some of them. So we really felt like we needed to do this today for our families of children with young children with disabilities. All right, Olivia, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Deb. And thank you to the Center for Disability Empowerment and the Ohio Family Network and DODD for making this happen. And I also want to thank Matt O'Brien, who is my Impact Ability teammate and an Impact Safety trainer instructor. Thank you everyone for being here today. So a little bit about who I am, how I got here, and what I do. I have been in the disability related field for over 30 years, and I have worn many hats. I was a direct support professional. I was a therapeutic consultant. I worked in residential settings, in homes, one-on-one. And what I saw was that people were vulnerable to abuse and victimization and lacked the skills and resources and support to reduce that risk. And as Deb mentioned earlier, when we went around the state doing Speak Up, Stay Safe, we often would ask people how many of them had had sexuality education of some type. And the majority responded with none. We haven't. So we know that people with disabilities are more likely to be abused and victimized, and yet they lack often the education and the resources to be more informed and to know better how to protect themselves. So that is one of the ways that I got here. And I got here through impact safety or impact ability, because I grew up and I didn't really know what it was like to feel emotionally and physically safe. And I thought that once I turned 18 and became an adult, I would magically be safer and I wouldn't be bullied. I would have safer relationships and I would be able to protect myself. And that wasn't true. That didn't happen. So I started learning how to defend myself through martial arts. And I became a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, women's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion. And yet I still didn't know what it was like to feel safe. And I came to Impact Safety, which is an empowered self-defense program. And it really changed my life. I learned the importance of boundary setting. And then I was able to do impactability, which combines those two passions, passion for working with people with disabilities and empowerment self-defense. And again, when I mention self-defense, I'm not talking necessarily fighting. It's about emotional self-defense as well. So what I do is currently, I am a healthy relationships and sexuality educator for people with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've been doing impactability online since COVID happened, and we've also been doing some in-person trainings. And it has been incredibly powerful to see people progress from the start to the finish and really use these skills in whatever ways they can, because we're teaching people of all different types of abilities with different communication styles and learning abilities to really find ways of empowering themselves in their own language. So as Deb also mentioned, there's such a need for people to talk to people, parents to talk to their young kids with disabilities early on. And that's really difficult. And I also want to commend you for stepping into this because it's very awkward and uncomfortable. I would say that most parents find it uncomfortable and awkward to talk about sexuality with their children or young adults. And people with children with disabilities also will have similar concerns with added layers. And so we're going to talk about that and find some ways to work with that. If there will be some points throughout this presentation where I'm going to pause and check in and ask Anne. So if you have something to say, please use the chat function. And Matt will be moderating that and checking that as we go along. If at some point I am going too fast, feel free to raise your hand with physically, somebody will be watching the gallery, or raise your hand with the controls, or say something in the chat. Or if there's something that I say that needs clarification, feel free to enter that in the chat. I also want to note that this is not meant to be a counseling session. I am not a counselor. I'm not here to give you prescriptive advice on how you need to live your life or raise your children. We are here to provide information based on experience, based on different experts and trainings, and that this is for you to take with you home or wherever you're at and really work with it and hopefully have some more resources and tools so you feel more supported. Some of the topics that we are going to be covering today: informal versus formal education, past and present, beliefs and values, why this is so important, some definitions, communication tools, and resources. We have a limited amount of time. I would love to talk about this for hours, but for time's sake, we're gonna just be touching on these components. Some of the things that I would like you to think about is, how do people with disabilities learn about sexuality? And that entails a lot of things. It could be, how do they learn about the emotions that come with sexuality? How do they learn about themselves? How do they learn about others? How do they learn about the names for things, the different acts? Or how do they learn about how to navigate relationships, conflict resolution, who they are in the world? How do people without disabilities, how do you think people without disabilities learn about sexuality? And how did you learn about sexuality? I know from my perspective, I learned somewhat of a crash course when I was a very young child because of an incident with a babysitter's child. And my mom ended up buying me a book and going through it with me. But there wasn't a lot, we didn't talk about a lot of things. And so I learned from my friends, from music, from sneaking into my friend's basement and watching MTV, which was forbidden. And how, and I also made a lot of choices that I thought would lead me to healthy, happy relationships and a sense of love. And that didn't always happen. So I'm just curious where this lands with you all. And I'm not going to interact about this particular subject, but that's something to think about, because these values and beliefs and attitudes do shape how we go forward and how we raise our kids, and how maybe we had a religious upbringing or cultural upbringing or different lenses. Maybe we had trauma. sexual assault abuse that impacted the way we felt about our bodies and our sexuality. And it's possible that that can then impact how we interact with others and how we raise our kids. When I talk about sexuality, I would say that the majority of people think I am talking about sexual acts and sexual intercourse. And that is pretty far from the truth. Sexuality is so much more than that. And that's why when people talk about comprehensive sexuality education, they're talking about all of these different things: social skills, friendship skills, physical health and emerging sexuality, relationship skills, values and beliefs, sexual orientation, thoughts and feelings, and gender identity. And this can be overwhelming, especially as we are learning more ways of being in the world, and there's more information out there. And back when I was growing up, pornography, I believe, was in shops and in video stores in restricted sections. Now it's free online. That is a huge difference. It's a very large difference between a magazine or a National Geographic. This is, again, dating me. So I'm a woman in my mid-40s. That's a lot different than what people are exposed to now. So this is, again, really important to address these things and think about these topics and find resources so we can be better prepared and understand how people, what people are being exposed to. Now I'd like to open this up for you to put something in the chat and think about what are some concerns that you have about talking to your child or a child you know about sexuality. This could be also a concern that you have or somebody you know has. Okay, I see some. I'm going to start reading some of the, so explaining things in a way that he understands. Absolutely. She thinks she is smarter than us, as do a lot of children and young adults. Do I wait until the child has questions, or do I begin the conversation? And I think sometimes we may think we are opening up a Pandora's box just because we talked about it. Feel free to continue to add in your thoughts or questions in the chat. So I'm going to actually address a couple of these, explaining things in a way that he understands. We will talk about this more towards the end and actually throughout the presentation about how to give your child information that is scientific without being overwhelming, how to break things down into manageable chunks, how to be age appropriate and also developmentally appropriate. Because the information is going to be the same, the difference is in how we deliver it and And again, I want to emphasize that you know your child, you know their limits, what works for them, what doesn't. And maybe they are somebody who doesn't want to talk about these things, or maybe they want to talk about these things all the time. Then let's see, she thinks she's smarter than us, right? So meeting them at their level and helping them understand that you are equipping them with information and resources. So when they are outside of your presence, because we know we can't be protecting and watching all the time, how do we empower them to make healthier choices and understand lingo, slang, understand tactics of people who may not have their best interest in mind. And as the title of this presentation, if not you, then who? If we don't provide that information, the issue is that they are likely going to get the information, but it may not be correct, more than likely not correct. And it's possible that it's going to be from people who don't have their best interest in mind. Do I wait until the child has questions, or do I begin the conversation? So this is a really good question. And I would say that that's a child-centered. If we are child-centered, we would wait for the child to have questions. But that puts the responsibility on the child. And so what we want to do is make sure that that foundation has been established or built. So we start giving the information early on if possible. And I want to also stress that this is not something I want to really try to disentangle or remove guilt and shame from this conversation. So if you haven't been able or felt comfortable talking to your child about sexuality, that's okay. You're here, and that's a huge first step. So it's about starting as early as possible, and so they know that you are a safe person that they can go to, that they can have questions, and that they're going to learn honest answers in a way that they can best understand. And I remember hearing an educator say, we don't expect our children to know what they need at the grocery store, young kids, or how to pay bills necessarily. So we can't expect them to come to us and ask questions about sexuality. And also, they may not have the language. They may not have the verbal skills or the capacity to ask the questions that they might wonder about or be curious about. So that's why it's really important to set that foundation. And the idea that we might be opening up a Pandora's box just because we talked about it, that is very common. I've heard parents say, I don't want to talk about it because I'm afraid that if I let them know kind of what's out there and what's going on, a switch might be flipped. And then all of a sudden, they're going to be wanting to do it all the time. They may be inappropriate. They may not know boundaries. And this could really just be, like Deb had said, a Pandora's box. I also want to add that that's been one of the arguments against sexuality education, that by talking about it, it's going to give people ideas, and that you're going to possibly turn people or make people more sexual and possibly engage in riskier behaviors. What research has shown, which I will talk about briefly in a little bit, is that if we look at, like, for example, the Netherlands is a country where they start early. They start talking about sexuality quite early. They have lower rates of teen pregnancy. They have lower rates of STIs. And so, and again, that's a cultural difference, but it is an example of how talking about it and giving people sexuality education at an early age actually does promote healthier safety. And that's also what I want to talk about, that this, if we frame this as being about health and safety, that can really be beneficial. Concerned that he may be manipulated to something which he didn't understand or may be hurt emotionally and physically. Absolutely. Which is why it's even more important that we give people the tools. Because, like, for example, if somebody, there's slang for sexual acts that don't really correlate or relate to the actual act. So if people are very literal and concrete thinkers, they may agree to doing things that they don't know really what they're getting into. And so we really want to make sure that we give people tools about what's going on, what people might talk about. And there's also a belief in, like, protecting somebody's innocence. It is possible that if somebody gets in a relationship, it's actually more likely than not that they're going to have their heart broken. And we can't protect our children from that, or our young adults. And people have a right to have relationships, and people also have a right to be asexual if they so choose. But it's that choice and that ability to have human connection and relationships that everyone has a right to. And so we can't protect them completely from being emotionally hurt or physically hurt, but we can give them the tools to be more empowered and have healthier boundaries. All the different types of gender, very confusing for a young preteen, absolutely. And it is gender and also sexual orientation. What is romantic attraction? What is erotic attraction? What is a friendship type of attraction? That can be really confusing. And you can also say, this is really confusing, I'm doing my best here. But, you know, I'll get back to you, or you can explore this together. You don't have to have all the answers. Right. So Deb says, we thought my brother with severe developmental disabilities wouldn't understand sex, even though he obviously was aroused. Right. So I will go to that in a second. It's difficult to make choices if one doesn't understand what's being negotiated. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are really helpful. So some of the beliefs, like let's talk about some of the beliefs that people have about sexuality and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Some of the beliefs are that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are asexual. When I was working with people as a direct care professional, I knew a parent who said, part of my daughter's disability that's a blessing is that she's asexual. Now that could be true. However, based on some of the conversations that I heard her having, what I noticed is that she met somebody online through Facebook, through a friend of a friend, and she was having very mature conversations, and he was asking her questions, and she was giggling, and she, thought she had a boyfriend. So in that situation, because she had already been determined to be asexual, and she also had birth control implants, there was a sense that she's safe from pregnancy, and she's safe from getting abused and hurt. But because she was not given that education, it's hard to tell. And then it was really putting people in a bind, because how do they communicate if they're also afraid of alerting her father as to what's going on, and he has very strong beliefs, and the house manager has beliefs of we want to keep the client. There are all these different people involved, and as a direct care professional, we didn't have a lot of training, if any, on how to navigate this. And I mean, I quite a few people, this is above my pay grade. I'm not dealing with this. I don't know how to deal with this. One staff person said, well, if this person comes to our house, we give them a condom and we let them do their thing. And another person said, we call her dad or we call the, there was just no consensus. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important. There's also the belief that people with disabilities can become hypersexual, not know boundaries, not know when it's appropriate or not appropriate to be sexual. They don't understand. It's that idea that if we teach them, they're going to do it all the time. And one of the questions I have is, does anybody actually know someone who was given sexuality education and then all of a sudden they became hypersexual? I personally don't know of anyone, and it's possible that somebody does, but it is a concern and a fear. And what we know is that research shows that people have they're less likely to be abused and engage in a lot of sexual activity, risky behaviors too early if they actually do have sexuality education. There's also a concern about public versus private, not knowing what's public and private. And that is something that Matt and I have also encountered when we're doing impactability courses. We show images of different settings. And one of them was a street, a residential neighborhood with a street with nobody. It was daytime, nobody's around that you could see. And we asked the students if this was public and private. And one student said, it's private because I can't see anyone out on the sidewalk. So like Matt has behind him in I don't know if people can see, but Matt has a bus stop. Is that private because nobody is around? No. So these are some of the things that we need to talk about, and really, what is public-private? What does public and private look like out in the community, in your home? If you're living with other people, is a bus, if you're in the back of a bus and it's at night, is that public or private? And this is really important information because it impacts people. We talk about victimization rates, but also there is unfortunately people with IDD who become perpetrators and registered sex offenders because they didn't know. They didn't know that what they were doing was wrong. And so it's really our duty to ensure everyone's health and safety to address some of these concerns. Good touch versus bad touch. This is really important as well, because especially when people rely on others, perhaps parents or caregivers, staff, to assist with personal care, whether it's in the bathroom or in their bedroom, different things, it can be really tricky to know what your body's boundaries are. I've spent a lot of time in hospitals getting sick and having various operations, and there was a sense for me personally of my body's not mine. The doctors didn't ask, is it okay if I touch you? I mean, it was just pull up your robe, and I got so used to that there was a certain numbing that was necessary for me to just sort of check out, dissociate, and make it through. And so I again, I'm not speaking for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but if somebody is really used to having their body touched and manipulated, or, you know, parents just walking into your child's room, and just assuming that it's your space and that they don't have a right to privacy. These are all things that go into that good touch, bad touch, and, you know, helping them understand context, that this is okay. And it's tricky. It's okay to go to a doctor, an OBGYN, and have them touch your vulva or your breasts in that setting, but it's not okay for that doctor to do it in a car or in different areas. There's also the belief or that they'll never grow up. I've heard many people say this isn't really relevant or necessary because my child or whoever will always be like a 5-year-old. And that is not fair. It really does a disservice. And while we all can have different likes and hobbies, and maybe somebody's developmental stages might look different from someone else, as a friend of mine, their occupational therapist said, when this person was around 26 years old, and somebody said they're just like, they'll always be like at a 5th grade level or 5-year-old, something to that extent. And the occupational therapist said, but they have 26 years of experience in that body and living their life. So really recognizing that it's not fair to say that they will never grow up, because a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 22 or 50-year-old is going to have the body and the hormones and the desires and the reactions of somebody of that biological age. I want to pause for a second and ask if there are any questions on what I've covered so far.
They can feel free to unmute themselves.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to move forward then. So research shows that people with disabilities are at higher risk of abuse. Sometimes the numbers are between 4 to 10 times more likely, 7 times more likely, and they're less likely to report and be believed. This is what's been reported. We also know from lived experience and anecdotes and shared stories that so many people are victims of abuse who didn't report because they were afraid of not being believed. And what's the point? When Deb and I were doing Speak Up, Stay Safe, we had counselors at each session, and every time multiple people disclosed abuse. In fact, when I would go to take a break, I would have people lined up to tell me their stories. And it was very clear that not giving them sexuality education wasn't helping in terms of preventing them from being abused and victimized. And we also had county board official or county board leaders. I've had superintendents talk to me, SSAs, case managers, direct support professionals say, you know, we brought some of our folks to your trainings, and we didn't realize, like, we didn't really know what they would get out of it. But we had so many people say the same sort of quotation. I didn't know that I didn't have to do that in order to have a boyfriend or girlfriend. And when I showed statistics of these numbers, I also had people say, I know I'm not alone now. So not only did they realize there were other options out there and choices, but it just hadn't been talked about or they hadn't been believed. So really making sure that we have those open channels of communication so people can get some of the support that they deserve in order to try and heal and recover from their trauma. There is not a lot of research so far that I've been able to find on people with intellectual disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, receiving comprehensive sexuality education and how that impacts their life. There is not a lot of longitudinal studies on this. I would love for there to be, and if anybody knows of anything, please let me know. But we know that for the most part, for people who do not have disabilities that we know of, that people who receive comprehensive sexuality education are more likely to have safer sex, they're more likely to report abuse, and they're more likely to be believed. The 3 C's: consent, compliance, and coercion. I am not a lawyer, so I am not going to go into too great of detail about this. But I will say that there is no one standardized assessment in Ohio or nationwide, I believe, for determining somebody's ability to consent if they have intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are different tools, but there is no one thing. Often what we hear is that it's a case-by-case basis. Having spoken with, back when we were doing Speak Up, Stay Safe, we talked with an attorney from Disability Rights Ohio who said, this is one way to think about consent. So when I'm talking about consent, I mean giving permission in whatever way form, whether that's verbal, saying yes, writing, pointing, nodding, that consent means yes. And not doing that, not saying anything is not consent. That is not an implied consent. It is not consent. And consent can be taken back. You can change your mind just because you consented to do something the day before or an hour before or 5 minutes before. You can stop and change your mind. Consent, I want to go back to what the lawyer said. She said, it is very tricky in Ohio. It also changes state by state. I want to note that Massachusetts, I believe, I think it could be Massachusetts, it is assumed that you are incapable of consenting if you have an intellectual and developmental disability, and you have to prove that you're able to consent. California is the opposite. It's assumed that you are able to consent unless proven otherwise. So in Ohio, I believe that it is assumed that you are able to consent and that you have to go through a court proceeding and a due process to have that right revoked. Sometimes guardians feel that they are able to, parents or guardians can feel that they are able to make that call. And I know that's tricky also when it comes to house rules, if somebody's still living at home. But this is also really something to think about and talk about if you have a case manager, SSA, planning, and really helping people understand informed consent. Give them the tools and the education and resources so they can make an informed decision, so they know what they're consenting to or not. And the attorney said that just as a guardian cannot make somebody consent to having sex because that would be trafficking or assault, they can't prohibit them from having sexuality, sexual relations. So that's something to consider. Compliance is really important, particularly because of the culture of the disability world. It's so important to fit in for so many people. And so oftentimes, and when we are in a position where we lack power and authority of our own lives, compliance is a way to have rights and abilities and do the things we want. We are fortunate if, you know, if we do, let's say we don't have, we haven't been diagnosed with a developmental disability, and we've been able to live into our adult lives without having somebody survey how we're doing on our daily tasks and writing plans to determine what kind of privileges we have. That's a really tough situation to be in. So that compliance, sometimes people comply because they don't really know any other choice, and they may depend on their caregivers for certain privileges.
Olivia?
Or yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt
That's
you,
okay.
but you know, we talked about compliance, and you know, we want our kids to fit in, and you know, especially when children have disabilities, you know, want them to fit in just so they have friends and you know, make those connections. But it's such a difference between compliance and consent. So, you know, that is the tricky part as they get older. You know, are they complying because they learn to say yes, no to people just to fit in versus consent where they're actually giving themselves permission to make the choice. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that. That is very true. And coercion is also tricky, because coercion can be also grooming. It can be positive ways of, or that could seem positive, of bribing somebody. And as parents, maybe we, you know, have bribed somebody to give them, I mean, there's chores and you get money. And that's one thing, but that's a little bit different than coercion that we're talking about. That's more about abuse and power and control. But there's also negative coercion, which is if threatening, if you don't do this, I'm going to do this. Coercion could be, if you want to be liked, part of our group, go do that with that person. These are some different ways. Coercion can also be nagging, being persistent, worn down. One of the things I want to add briefly is we would also ask people when we did Speak Up, Stay Safe. And we do this in our impactability classes as well. We ask people who is more likely to be abusive or abuse somebody. Is it a stranger or someone you know? And overwhelmingly, people will say strangers. And while there are dangers with meeting people who are unsafe and we don't know, statistics, data from Ohio, and that correlates nationally as well. The majority of people who are perpetrators or abusers are people we know. And that's really messy and unfortunate, because trying to teach people how to trust and who's safe to trust, that can be very tricky. Also, I want to really quickly say consent is also about capacity and capability. So there's definitely more information about that on the legal aspect, but I want to talk about consent as something that you can also start with little children. Is it okay if I touch you? I have a dentist who every time I sit in his chair, he says, is it okay if I touch your head? That kind of checking in, is it okay if I do this, is very important. So some of the tips to building, sorry, I'm trying to Skills and confidence when talking about sexuality. So here's an image of a white woman with brown hair with her fingers covering her eyes. She's looking very shy or embarrassed or awkward. So it's okay to feel embarrassed. Start earlier wherever you are now. It's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to self-correct. Hey, I really screwed up that conversation. I answered it. I didn't know the right answers. Can I revisit that? Show you're human. It's okay. You don't have to be perfect. And you don't have to know everything. If somebody asks you a question that you don't understand or you don't know the answer to, it's a really good question. Let me get back to you on that. You know your child's mood and abilities to process. You know when is a good time to talk and when's not such a great time to talk. Choose safer and more relaxed times and spaces. Break it, try not to overwhelm them. Break it into manageable chunks, maybe a 3-minute. Hey, so I just heard this thing about periods. Let me tell you about periods and what happens. Or you can say, hey, would you like to have a sex talk now or later? And if they say later, okay, so next day. So now it's later. And I'd like to talk. It could be in the car. It could be maybe your child doesn't want direct eye contact. It could be while you're doing an activity. And that practice gets your reps in and helps, ease hopefully both your comfort levels. Use teachable moments. So a teachable moment is a way to, I'll give an example. Your child says, what's an erection? And you can say, that's a really good question. So before you start answering and going with, okay, well, it's when the blood is da 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 da. Find out what they are asking or what they think it is. Get them to tell you. It could just be, oh, I heard from a friend that so and so had an erection, and I'm just wondering about it. And then you want to decide what messages you want to give. You can talk about the physical component, you can talk about the emotional components and the social components. So these are the feelings that somebody might have. This is where what to do if you're in a social situation and you are experiencing an erection or somebody you know is, and like in the physical. So 3 different components of that. Answer simply using accurate technology or terminology, and then encourage them to give you feedback. How'd I do with that? Do you have any more questions? Feel free to come and talk to me about that later. I want to go quickly through some age groups. I find this really helpful so people can also understand what is typical or not so typical sexual development. Now, again, each person is unique, but these are some general categories for childhood sexual development. And this is from the National Sexual Violence Research Center. So infancy, ages 0 to 2. This is when they're curious about their bodies. They're exploring what they can fit in their mouth or what goes where. And it's really understanding what's my body and what is not. They might touch their genitals in public and in private. They are not going to have inhibitions around nudity. They don't have shame. This is an adult concept. So that is what you can do for these ages is teach correct names for all body parts. Start early. Please don't use cute terms. It's not helpful. And when you're talking about your body parts, so this is your eyes, your nose, and that's your penis or your vagina or different things. And you just make it matter of fact. so they know. Help children understand at this age group how to interact with others respectfully, and give simple answers about body functions. Ages 2 to 5. This is early childhood. There might be occasional masturbation for self-soothing. This is not masturbation in terms of sexual pleasure that we would think of for somebody who is in puberty or adulthood. Again, our adult minds can get a little freaked out when we see a little child doing this. They don't have the capacity or the body to have the same sort of attachment to masturbation that an adult or a prepubescent child will. There can be playful exploration with peers. So people who are children who are the same age, they might play house, they might play doctor, and it's curious. They may be curious about where babies come from and adult bodies. Deb.
I wanted to share something that happened with my daughter when she was about 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I let her go to a friend's house overnight. And the mother called me and told me that she had the baby monitor on, and she heard her daughter say, "Well, you can touch me." Now, I raised my girls to say, no one can touch you, just because I didn't have great sexual education as a kid. But I never thought to say, if someone wants you to touch them, to not do that. And I just never thought about that. And I'm so grateful that she has a baby monitor on and told me, and I didn't freak out because we were doing our best to keep our kids safe. But I will tell you that I no longer let them do sleepovers because of that.
Mm-hmm. And that can also, thank you for sharing, Deb. That can be really alarming. And it can be really alarming if you walk in and you see your 4-year-old with their 4-year-old cousin, touching each other's genitals. And so rather than get really upset or yell at them, no, stop. I see you're touching each other's private parts, or you're, name them, whatever they might be. And there are ways that you can talk so it's not shaming, and explain what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And this is also a time when, so if your child is walking in on you in the bathroom or wanting to touch you, you can have your own boundaries and say what's appropriate and what's privacy, what's not. Provide basic information about reproduction. Babies come from uteruses or from a belly, or that kind of information. There will possibly be slang terms and potty humor as they realize that they can get these things are kind of funny, and they can get a reaction if they say certain things. And teach boundaries around bodies and touch. So rather than immediately jumping in, if let's say there's some rough housing or touching, how do you feel about that? Or did you like that when he got on top of you and was wrestling with you? And if your child says no, and say, okay, so you can say, I don't like that. Or teach them ways of holding up stop signs. Do you want to, this is also the thing, you don't have to hug everybody who comes in. Just because your aunt comes in and is doing this, you don't have to hug them. So teach your child that it's okay to say no, and that they have a right to have boundaries and touch, and that they also need to be respectful of other people's. 5 to 8, continued use of slang terms. Again, this is for people who might be verbal, who are using verbal words. there can be deeper understanding of gender roles, or playing with knowing that maybe they want to dress up a certain way or play with these toys. And this is often where gendered stereotypes come in too as well. And it's really important to promote understanding of gender and personal rights. There could be sex play with peers. So again, peers. And this is typical child development. This is not necessarily, this is not indicative that there's going to be a problem or that they're going to be hypersexual. This is how a lot of children learn. They may be curious about where babies come from, and they might masturbate for pleasure. Self-soothing could help them sleep. These are things that could happen. So it's important that you teach that that occurs in private, and what are some of the rules or agreements you have about that. Talk about changes that may be happening when it comes to puberty, because that will be happening. And that you don't want your child to just be surprised when all of a sudden things are a lot different and they're a roller coaster of emotions. There's hairs and smells and fluids and all the things. Okay. Late childhood, 9 to 12. Increased need for privacy and independence. They may be interested in relationships. I also want to note that there are children who are exposed to pornography at a very young age because, let's say, their friends have access to a phone and they don't have controls or privacy settings on them. So it's important to pay attention and see and know kind of what your kid has access to and who they're playing with and what kind of rules or agreements they have in their household as well. As Deb was saying, sleepovers, know who's at that house too. If your kid is sleeping over and they have adult or older, that person has older siblings, you need to know that, and you can ask that if you don't feel comfortable with them being there when there are other kids who are older there. They may be curious about adult bodies. They may be looking for more material, trying to, like the current version of MTV, or just looking at what is that all about. It might feel funny and curious about that. So this is also an important time to do differences between fiction and reality in media, and encouraging that social media literacy, and keep talking about changes with puberty. When is it concerning? I'm going to just go with the concerning here. When play is really aggressive and angry. Now, again, this doesn't mean that your child is dangerous, but just note, okay, this seems like too much. They're not stopping when we're asking them to. It seems to ramp up. The curiosity or sexual play is with children a lot older or a lot younger. And this can be really challenging when people have different developmental ages. So just because, so if let's say you have two kids with disabilities and one is 18, but likes to hang out or play with the younger kids, be careful about, just note what are some of those boundaries and what kind of play is okay or not. And when, behaviors cause harm, when somebody is emotionally or physically harmed. So boundaries, think about what are your family rules or agreements in various spaces, such as your home, your school, in the neighborhood, out in the community. What is public or private? And when we did the Speak Up, Stay Safe, we also talked about the actions, words, and behaviors. What is okay in these different situations? What kind of touch is okay? Talk. What kind of information do you trust to different people? Circles has a curriculum. You can do your own circles. Who are the people in my life? I think you have something similar to that in Charting the Life course, right, Deb?
Yes.
So who are the people in my life, and what's okay and what's not okay?
You know, Livy, you mentioned this week about different rules in different spaces. So
Mm-hmm,
a rule at home may be different than a rule in a bus, and a
mm-hmm,
rule at school, at a neighbor's. I don't know. I thought that was a good point that you mentioned, um, that you may have to be really specific, say, when we're home, blah, 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 when you were on the bus and there are rules there.
mm-hmm,
Sometimes we have to be clearer in those different roles.
mm-hmm. Do you have an example or?
Hmm. I don't know. You mentioned something about a car. So there was a rule at home.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Thank you. Um, so for example, what touch is appropriate with your own body and in different spaces? If you are with other people and you're in a car, it may feel private, but because you're in a car. But let's say somebody is picking their nose and then putting their fingers in their mouths. That is something that is not socially acceptable, but it's something that, some people do. So how do we talk about that in a way that's not shaming? And so it could be, this is from a friend of mine who helped teach me this, is so when we're in the car, we have some rules. One of them is we we try not to spill food all over the back seat. We say when we need to go to the bathroom. So we tell somebody so we can stop ahead of time. If we have to pick our nose, we'll ask for a tissue. And then we use that tissue and we throw it away. And then something else like we wear our seatbelts. So these are some of the rules. Can we all agree to that? And that way we're making it more level and neutral and not value charged. Could also be when we're in the kitchen, we don't put our hands down our pants. If we do go to the bathroom or put our hands down the pants, we need to wash our hands and not touch food right afterwards. So those are some of the things. What are some of the rules that your family has or values? Secrets. In impactability, we say if somebody asks you to keep a secret, you can say no, you can say yes, that's the time you could lie, and then you go tell. That is a rule. Like Deb said, sleepovers, talking about what's okay and what's not. Access to computers, devices, and media. Now, you can find a lot of things without using actual search terms that might be related to pornography. So, really negotiating that as well. And what are your rules about privacy? So I also do want to quickly touch on what to do if you suspect abuse or someone discloses abuse. So I did not include a whole chart on signs and symptoms of abuse. And my reason is that I'm concerned that if we have this list and somebody experiences something or acts in a way that doesn't fit on this list, that people will say, well, it's not on this list, therefore they must not be abused. Or conversely, that maybe they are doing something and that's absolutely abuse. They must be abused. And it's not that black and white. So I would default to, your kid. If let's say that their norm is self-injurious behavior, and all of a sudden they stop, from the outside looking in, somebody could say, oh, that's great. But maybe it's that they have a fever and they don't feel well anymore. So it's that deviating from like kind of their norm. If they are I'll say a couple of things. If they all of a sudden are doing things sexual that they've not done before, that could be a clue or something to pay attention to. And the importance of reporting. Help them in whatever way they communicate. Learn to identify different key factors. So whether that's a picture board or communication device, or saying that person has light skin or dark skin, long hair, things that are not easily changed. This is what we do. One of the things we do in impactability is really focus on reporting. And who are the safe people to talk to? Who do you go to? If you get DD services, now, if there's an emergency or somebody's life is in immediate danger, you call 911. And if you suspect abuse, you're not sure, and if somebody's not in immediate danger, you can contact you can call the MUI hotline, Major Unusual Incident Hotline, with Ohio DODD, Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities, your county board. You can tell your SSA. Basically, keep talking until somebody believes you. And then what are the plans? Like what next? What do we do if something is, if there is abuse? Final tips. Try to be open, non-judgmental, honest, kind. Prepare, don't scare. The scare tactics, while you might think that that's a way to keep your kids safe, it is not really the most empowered way for people to move through the world. And we also can't protect against everything. So trust in your good intentions, their resilience, that you are building that foundation. And know that you're not alone. Ask for support. There are so many resources now. There are other communities online, in person. There are ways of getting more information if you need it. And also, I want to end with a couple of things. These are adult self-advocates, and they are talking about, it's a picture of a white woman who is using an electric wheelchair, and a white gender ambiguous person standing next to them, holding a sign saying "We are all humans." And sexual self-advocacy to them is important, so we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we can be safe, we can make informed choices, so people know their rights, so they're not lonely, so we can pick the right person. These are all some of the reasons that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities deserve to be informed. We are going to be doing a presentation more about what we do with impactability, and that is on June 9th, I believe, with CDE. And we'll talk more about what we do with impactability 1, which is that empowered self-defense. Impactability 2, which is more in depth about sexuality and relationships. We have a parent workshop that is specifically geared to help parents talk about sexuality and understand sexuality in their children. A staff workshop that's for professionals, direct support professionals and providers, about sexuality and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have a course on online safety, which is so important and so huge, but we also will tailor it to the needs of the group or the individual. And we also finally offer consultation services to individuals and agencies and groups. Deb, you will have you'll be able to share these
Yes.
Amaze.org, I just want to highlight really quickly. I also, Elevatus, I was trained through Elevatus. They're wonderful. Catherine McLaughlin does great training. Amaze.org has little cartoons that are age appropriate and inclusive and phenomenal. And there are also the Heartful Parent has a safe and savvy, or I forget exactly what it is, but they have a whole bunch of books that are working, talking to your kids about consent and bodies and sexuality. So that's also really helpful. If you have any questions or would like more information or additional resources, please don't hesitate to contact me at olivia@impactsafety.org. And thank you all so much. And I am open for questions.
So Olivia, I would like you to explain about the cookie, the importance of using precise names.
Yeah. So, there was a young girl with disabilities who was talking about how her uncle kept touching her cookie. And that was, or taking her cookie. So that something, this is why it's important to talk about real terms. And when somebody knows the accurate terms for their body parts, they're also, like I said, more likely to report and be believed. And they also don't have, if a perpetrator goes to touch them, they say, "Stop, don't touch my penis." That has a different message than somebody who may be not able to really even know what the body parts are, and how do they then tell somebody. And again, there are different ways of communicating that. So those are some important reasons. It's not empowering for people to use the incorrect terms.
Do we have any questions? You can feel free to unmute.